In the autumn of 1887, across the vast, flat expanse of Pembina County in the Dakota Territory, a familiar ritual of survival began to unfold. The air, once thick with the scent of curing hay and turned earth, sharpened with a metallic edge that promised a winter of profound severity. Settlers, men who had learned their craft from fathers and neighbors on the tamer frontiers of Ohio and Illinois, moved with a practiced rhythm. They banked their log cabins, piling thick sod, loose earth, and manure against the foundations and lower walls. It was a bulwark of solid mass, a tradition as old as their westward push, intended to blunt the coming assault of wind and cold. They worked with the confidence of men who knew the rules of their world. Thicker is warmer. Mass is strength. Yet, on a small quarter section of land bordering a sluggish bend of the Tongue River, one man broke this rhythm. His name was Lars Eriksson, a Norwegian immigrant whose quiet demeanor and infrequent speech made him a figure of gentle curiosity and, increasingly, of open ridicule. While his neighbors packed the earth, Lars was engaged in an act of baffling strangeness. He was building a fence, not a fence for his livestock, which were already secured in a sturdy paddock, but a fence around his house. He methodically set cedar posts into the ground, a consistent 18 inches out from the sturdy log walls of his modest cabin. Then, using rough-sawn planks from the mill in Cavalier, he began sheathing these posts, creating a thin secondary wall that entirely encircled his home. The work was slow and deliberate. It consumed lumber that could have been used for a larger barn or a new shed. It consumed time that, in the eyes of his neighbors, should have been spent cutting and stacking a mountain of firewood. They called it wasteful. They called it foolish. Silas Miller, a man whose successful farm and booming voice had made him the township's unofficial arbiter of common sense, stopped his wagon on the track overlooking Lars's property. He watched for a long time, his brow furrowed in genuine disbelief. "That's a fence around a house," he declared to anyone who would listen. "He's building a box for his box. What's next? A roof for his roof?" The sentiment rippled through the small community. Laughter followed. They began to call the strange structure Eriksson's Folly. The name stuck, a verbal monument to what they saw as the profound ignorance of a foreigner who simply didn't understand the Dakota frontier. They called it wasteful. They called it foolish. But their laughter would not last the winter. That season would bring with it a meteorological horror, a storm so sudden and so violent it would be seared into the region's memory as the schoolhouse blizzard of 1888. On January 12th, a deceptive morning of mild temperatures would give way to an afternoon of atmospheric fury. The temperature would plummet more than 50 degrees in a matter of hours, and winds screaming at 60 miles per hour would drive a blinding, flour-fine snow across the plains. In the standard cabins, banked with frozen earth, the cold would creep through the logs like a stain. Stoves would devour wood, yet offer only a pitiful circle of warmth. Families would huddle in desperation, their breath frosting in the air inside their own homes. Many would not survive. Yet, inside the strange, double-walled cabin of Lars Eriksson, a different reality would unfold. A small fire would keep the single room at a comfortable temperature. The wind would howl outside, but inside, a profound and life-giving stillness would reign. The folly would become a fortress. The fool would become a prophet. What did he understand about the simple, immutable laws of thermodynamics that everyone else dismissed as foolish? What knowledge, carried across an ocean from the snowbound mountains of Norway, had he translated into cedar posts and sawdust that would mean the difference between life and death on the American plains? The answer lay not in thicker walls, but in the space between them, not in fighting the cold with mass, but in taming it with nothing at all. Lars Eriksson was a product of Telemark, a region of Norway where mountains clawed at the sky, and winter was not a season but a dominant state of being. He had grown up in a world where survival was a form of artistry, a deep and intuitive understanding of how to coexist with a cold that could kill a man in minutes. The houses of his youth, the traditional Stavlaft buildings, were marvels of practical engineering. They were built not just with massive timbers, but with an obsessive attention to joinery. Every notch, every corner was cut with surgical precision to minimize the intrusion of the wind. They understood that the smallest crack, the tiniest gap, was an open door for the cold. But more than that, they understood the power of insulation. They chinked their logs with moss that held its loft even when compressed, creating tiny pockets of air that resisted the transfer of heat. When Lars immigrated to America, first to the logging camps of Minnesota, he carried this ingrained knowledge with him. He observed the American methods with a quiet, analytical eye. He saw cabins built quickly, with impressive, thick logs, but with sloppy chinking that was little more than mud and straw. He saw men who believed a bigger fire was the only answer to a colder night, a philosophy he found wasteful and brutish. His first job away from the camps was helping construct an ice house for a large dairy operation near Duluth. It was here that a crucial piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The ice house was a simple barn-like structure, but its walls were hollow, nearly 2 feet thick. All summer long, as the Minnesota sun beat down, the men would pack this cavity with sawdust from the nearby mill. Lars was astonished to see that while the outer planks grew hot to the touch, the massive blocks of ice inside remained frozen solid. The foreman, a gruff man with little patience for questions, simply said, "It's the sawdust, keeps the heat out." But Lars knew it wasn't the wood fibers themselves. It was the air. The millions upon millions of tiny pockets of air trapped between the particles of sawdust, unable to move, unable to circulate, formed a barrier that heat could barely penetrate. The final piece of his understanding came not from a building, but from a man. While working as a surveyor's assistant, mapping tracks for the railroad in northern Dakota, his party hired a local Cree trapper named Chayton as a guide. One evening, as a bitter autumn wind scoured their canvas tents, Lars watched Chayton build his shelter. He did not seek the dense, hard-packed snowdrifts. Instead, he found a place where the snow was deep, light, and undisturbed. He dug a small pit and covered it with a frame of willow branches and a hide. Lars, accustomed to the Norwegian practice of building solid shelters, asked why he chose the softest snow. Chayton, a man of even fewer words than Lars, pointed to the deep drift. "That is apus," he said, using the Cree word for snow. "The wind has not broken it. The air still lives inside." He explained that a blanket of deep, fresh snow was one of the warmest things in nature. The intricate lattice of ice crystals trapped vast quantities of air, creating a layer of insulation so effective that a hibernating bear could sleep beneath it in perfect safety. The lesson was profound. The enemy was not the snow or the cold, but the wind that stripped away the protective layer of still air. These 3 streams of knowledge, the meticulous construction of his homeland, the observed reality of the ice house, and the ancient wisdom of the Cree, coalesced in Lars's mind into a single, powerful principle. The most effective barrier to the transfer of heat was not a solid object, but a space filled with trapped, unmoving air. In physics, this is the core of insulation. Heat moves in three ways: conduction, the transfer through direct contact; convection, the transfer through the movement of fluids like air or water; and radiation, the transfer through electromagnetic waves. A solid log wall fights conduction reasonably well, but it does little to stop it. Heat from inside the cabin warms the inner surface of the log, and that energy slowly, steadily conducts its way to the outer surface, where it is stripped away by the wind. Convection was the greater enemy inside. Hot air from the stove would rise to the ceiling, cool as it contacted the cold roof and walls, and then sink, creating a constant, uncomfortable, and energy-wasting circular current. Lars's idea was designed to defeat these processes. A second outer wall would stop the wind, the primary engine of heat loss. The space between the walls, when filled with a light, airy material like sawdust, would create millions of tiny air pockets. This dead air would virtually stop both conduction and convection. The inner log wall would no longer be battling a 60-mile-per-hour wind at 20 below zero. It would be facing a calm, insulated space only a few degrees cooler than the room itself. It was a simple, elegant solution that turned conventional wisdom completely on its head. The construction of his cabin began in the spring of 1887. He chose his logs with care, felling straight, mature cottonwoods and painstakingly peeling the bark. Unlike his neighbors, who often settled for a rough, saddle-notched corner, Lars spent weeks cutting tight, full dovetail notches. When assembled, the corners of his cabin were so precise they seemed to be a single piece of wood, leaving almost no room for chinking. For the gaps that did exist, he used a mixture of dried moss harvested from the riverbank and a fine clay, a combination he knew would expand and contract with the logs without cracking and falling out. His first break from local custom was the ceiling. While his neighbors favored high ceilings, believing it gave the bad air a place to go, Lars framed his at a height of just 6 feet and 10 inches. He knew that a high ceiling was a reservoir of cold, a vast, useless volume that he would have to heat. His aim was to create a small, tight, livable envelope. Once the main cabin was finished, a sturdy and respectable structure by any standard, he began the work that would earn him his reputation for eccentricity. He purchased a wagon load of cedar posts and began setting them in a perimeter around the cabin. Silas Miller, his closest and most vocal neighbor, stopped by during this phase. Silas was not a malicious man, but he was a proud one, a man who had tamed his piece of the prairie through hard work and adherence to proven methods. He saw Lars's project as an affront to that hard-won knowledge. "Erickson," he said, leaning on his wagon wheel, "I don't mean to tell you your business, but what in creation are you doing? There's no beast on this prairie that's going to get through a log wall." Lars paused his work, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He looked at Silas, then at the posts, then back at Silas. "Not for beasts," he said, his Norwegian accent still thick. "For the wind," Silas chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound. "The wind. You fight the wind with a good fire and a tight wall, not a picket fence." He gestured to the pile of rough-sawn planks. "That's a waste of good lumber, man. You could build a fine chicken coop with that. You're just building a giant home for rats and rot between those walls." Lars offered a small, polite nod and returned to his work. The dismissal did not anger him. It was what he expected. He knew his idea was sound. He had calculated it. He had seen the principals at work with his own eyes. He began nailing the planks to the posts, creating the outer shell. He left the top of the cavity open. For the next several weeks, he made trips to the sawmill, returning with wagon loads of dry sawdust and shavings. He mixed this with more dried moss he had painstakingly gathered. Then, bucket by bucket, he began pouring the mixture into the 18-inch gap between the walls. Mr. Abernathy, the young schoolteacher who boarded with the Miller family, was intrigued. Unlike Silas, he was driven by curiosity. He walked over one afternoon and watched Lars work. "Why sawdust, Mr. Erickson?" he asked. "Silas claims it will just get damp and rot your logs." Lars stopped and picked up a handful of the mixture, letting it run through his fingers. "It must be dry," he said, looking at the teacher directly. "Bone dry. Water carries the cold. Dry air stops it." He paused, searching for the English words. "The air will keep us warm." When Abernathy pressed for a more detailed explanation, Lars could only offer 2 words, a phrase that would become part of the local lore of his folly: dead air. The simple, cryptic answer only deepened the mystery and heightened the community's amusement. To them, dead air sounded like stagnant, unhealthy air. It sounded like something you wanted to get out of your house, not trap inside its walls. As autumn deepened, Lars capped the walls, sealing the insulation against the coming snows. He had ignored the commentary. He had worked methodically, his confidence rooted not in pride, but in a quiet certainty. Erickson's folly was complete. The 12th of January, 1888, dawned with a strange and unsettling warmth. The temperature hovered just above freezing, and a light mist softened the hard edges of the winter landscape. Children, released from their cabins by the mild weather, made their way to the one-room schoolhouse, their laughter echoing in the humid air. But by mid-morning, the sky in the northwest began to change, darkening to a terrifying shade of bruised purple. The wind, which had been a mere whisper, began to moan, and then, with shocking speed, it shrieked. A solid wall of white descended upon the prairie. The schoolhouse blizzard had arrived. Within an hour, the temperature had fallen to 20 degrees below zero. The wind, a steady 60-mile-per-hour gale, picked up the loose snow and blasted it horizontally across the plains. Visibility dropped to zero. To step outside was to be instantly lost in a churning, blinding chaos of white. It was a storm that did not just bring cold, but manufactured it, the wind chill driving the effective temperature down to a life-threatening 40 or 50 below. It was the test that Lars Erickson had been preparing for, and the crisis his neighbors had failed to properly imagine. Inside Silas Miller's cabin, the reality of the storm was making itself known. The cabin was well built by conventional standards, with thick 10-inch logs and a towering fieldstone fireplace. The banked earth and manure around its base, which had seemed so sensible in the autumn, had frozen into a solid mass. Instead of insulating, this frozen block now acted as a thermal bridge, conducting the profound cold of the ground directly into the base of the log walls. The wind, a physical, pounding force, found every tiny imperfection in the chinking. A fine, smoke-like powder of snow began to jet through invisible cracks, forming surreal, growing drifts along the walls and in the corners of the room. Silas's wife, Mary, stuffed rags into the worst of the gaps, but it was a futile effort. The single log walls, directly exposed to the howling wind, were frigid. Any object placed near them quickly became ice cold. The family huddled near the hearth, where Silas fed split oak into the fire, with a grim regularity. The stove, a large and modern cast-iron model, glowed a dull red, but its heat seemed to travel only a few feet before being swallowed by the immense cold of the room. The cabin's high, vaulted ceiling, a feature Silas had always pointed to with pride, had become a terrible liability. All the precious heat from the stove rose into the cavernous space above their heads, where it met the freezing roof deck and was lost. A relentless convective loop was established. The hot air rose, cooled, and then descended along the outer walls as a miserable, inescapable draft. They were living in a convection oven set on reverse. The fire that should have been their salvation was instead the engine of their discomfort, driving the very currents that chilled them to the bone. Worse, the stove's appetite was insatiable. It consumed wood at a rate Silas had never seen before. By the second day, the wood box inside was empty. The main woodpile was 50 yards away, a journey that was now tantamount to a polar expedition. Bundled in every piece of clothing he owned, Silas tied a rope from the doorknob to his wrist and plunged into the whiteout. He could not see his own feet. He stumbled toward the woodpile, a ghost in a world of shrieking noise and stinging ice. The wood was buried under a deep drift, each piece glazed with a glass-thick layer of ice from the initial mist. He chipped away what he could and hauled a frozen, snow-caked armload back to the house. When he fed the icy logs into the stove, they sputtered and smoked, producing more acrid fumes than heat, filling the already miserable cabin with a choking haze. The physics of failure were absolute. Less than a mile away, inside Ericsson's Folly, a different set of physical laws were at play. The first and most obvious difference was the sound. The violent shriek of the wind was muffled, reduced to a distant, mournful howl. The outer plank wall was taking the full force of the gale, acting as a massive windbreak. It disrupted the airflow, creating a pocket of relatively calm air in the 18-inch cavity. There was no physical pressure driving snow through the chinking of the inner logs. The interior of the cabin was utterly free of drafts and fine dusting snow. It was an island of stillness in an ocean of turmoil. The thermal performance was even more dramatic. The 18-inch layer of sawdust and moss was doing its job with near-perfect efficiency. The extreme cold of the blizzard had to first penetrate the outer plank wall. Then, it had to conduct through the millions of trapped air pockets in the insulation. This process was incredibly slow. The dead air resisted any convective movement, and the sheer number of wood fibers and moss particles interrupted the path of conduction. By the time the cold reached the outer surface of the main log wall, it was a pale imitation of the fury outside. Lars placed his hand on the inner surface of the log wall. It was cool, but not cold. It felt like the wall of a cellar in autumn, not a barrier against a polar vortex. Because the walls were not leaching heat from the room, the small, efficient stove Lars had brought from Norway had to work very little. A few small pieces of dry wood kept the interior at a steady, comfortable 65 degrees. The low 7-foot ceiling was a critical part of the system. It kept this bubble of warmth concentrated in the living space, preventing the formation of cold drafts. The heat radiated gently and evenly throughout the single room. His wife, Anya, could work at the table in the far corner, wearing a simple wool shawl, while his young son, Peter, slept soundly in his cot, breathing the warm, clean air. Lars's wood was stored in a small lean-to he had built against the outer wall. It was completely sheltered from the wind and snow, and it was easily accessible from a small, secondary door he had built. The wood was bone dry and burned cleanly and efficiently, producing maximum heat with minimum smoke. The physics of success were quiet, undramatic, and absolute. Lars was not a man to leave things to feeling alone. He was a creature of measurement and observation. Tacked to a post near the stove was a small mercury thermometer he had purchased in St. Paul. Throughout the first day and night of the storm, he made regular observations. Outside, the temperature, when he could shield the thermometer from the wind, registered a steady 22 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Inside, the thermometer never wavered from a line between 64 and 66 degrees. He recorded these numbers, along with the time, in a small ledger. He also made a note of his fuel consumption. He knew, from a season of observation, that on a normal cold day of 0 degrees, Silas Miller would burn nearly a quarter of a cord of wood. Lars, in conditions far more extreme, was using less than a third of that amount. He performed a simple smoke test, holding a smoldering wick near the windows and door seals. The thin ribbon of smoke rose straight up, undisturbed. There were no drafts. This was not just a feeling of comfort. It was measurable, verifiable proof. His system worked. The data was irrefutable. By the morning of the third day, the situation at the Miller cabin had grown desperate. The temperature inside had dropped to just a few degrees above freezing. Every blanket was piled onto the beds, but the penetrating cold was relentless. They had begun burning furniture, first a broken chair, then a small side table. The acrid smell of varnish filled the air. Mary's face was etched with fear. Their youngest child, a baby boy named Samuel, was listless. His skin was cold to the touch, and his cries were weak and shallow. He was showing the first terrifying signs of hypothermia. Silas knew they would not last another night. The fire was dying, and all that was left to burn was the house itself. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. There was only one place to go, one slim hope. He had to get to Ericsson's Folly. He bundled himself again, his movements stiff from the cold. He found the rope, now frozen stiff as a wire, and stepped out into the maelstrom. The journey was a nightmare of disorientation and pain. The wind tore at him, and the cold burned his exposed cheeks in seconds. He followed the rope line to his barn, and from there, navigated by memory and instinct, stumbling through drifts that were over his head. He fell a dozen times. Finally, he slammed into something solid. It was the plank wall of Lars's cabin. He felt his way along it until he found the door and hammered on it with his frozen fist. The door swung open, and Silas Miller fell into another world. He was not hit with a blast of heat, but with a wave of profound, enveloping calm. The air was warm, still, and smelled faintly of baking bread and dry wood. He saw Lars, his face calm, and Anya, her expression one of concern, not triumph. He saw young Peter playing on the floor with wooden blocks, wearing only a simple woolen shirt. Silas staggered forward, his body shaking uncontrollably as the warmth began to penetrate his frozen layers of clothing. He looked around the small, bright room, at the placid smoke rising from the candle, at the thermometer on the wall, its silver line resting comfortably in the 60s. He touched the inner log wall. It was cool, yes, but it was a living coolness, not the dead, soul-leeching cold of his own home. The vindication was absolute, and it was silent. Silas did not offer an apology. The words would have been too small for the magnitude of his error. His pride, which had seemed so important just days ago, had been scoured away by the wind and the cold. He looked at Lars, the man he had openly mocked, the man whose strange project was now the only reason his family might survive. In a quiet, hoarse voice, he asked the question that signaled his complete surrender to a wisdom greater than his own. "The gap," he said, his eyes meeting Lars's. "The sawdust. How wide did you make it?" Lars looked at the broken man before him and felt no triumph, only a shared sense of humanity in the face of the storm's immense power. 18 inches, he replied simply. Wide enough so the cold cannot jump. Wide enough for the air to die. He then turned to his wife. Anya, put on the coffee. We will bring them over. There was no self-congratulation, no hint of, I told you so. Lars acted with a quiet grace that was more profound than any spoken rebuke. He helped Silas back to his cabin, and together they carried Mary and the children through the storm to the sanctuary Lars had built. They wrapped the infant Samuel in warm blankets and placed him near the gentle, steady heat of the stove. Within an hour, the color began to return to the baby's cheeks. His weak cry grew stronger. He would live. The quiet Norwegian, the fool with his fence around a house, had saved the family of his chief skeptic. When the great blizzard finally broke on the fourth day, the sun rose on a world transformed, a landscape of sculpted white dunes under a sky of impossible blue. The news of the Miller family's rescue and the impossible warmth of the Eriksson cabin spread like wildfire through the devastated community. It was the only story that mattered. As people emerged to check on their neighbors and tally their losses, livestock frozen in the fields, homes nearly uninhabitable, the legend of Eriksson's folly was rewritten. It was no longer a joke, it was a miracle. A week later, a meeting was held at the town hall. It was Silas Miller who stood before the assembled families. His voice, usually so full of bluster and certainty, was quiet and measured. He told them of the freezing drafts, the insatiable fire, the smoke, and the terror. He told them of his son's failing life. Then he described stepping into Lars Eriksson's cabin. He spoke of the silence, the steady warmth, the sheer impossibility of it. I was wrong, he said, his gaze sweeping across the faces of his neighbors. We were all wrong. We thought we knew this land, but we didn't. We were fighting the winter with brute force. Lars. He outsmarted it. He then turned to Lars, who was standing quietly at the back of the room. Lars, he said, will you teach us? Lars, a man unaccustomed to public speaking, was hesitant, but he saw the genuine hunger for knowledge in their eyes. He walked to the front of the room. He did not give a speech. Instead, he asked for 2 tin cups, a large can, and a bucket of sawdust from the livery. He had Mr. Abernathy fill both cups with boiling water from the hall's stove. He placed 1 cup on the table. He placed the other inside the large can and carefully packed the space around it with sawdust, filling it to the brim. Then he simply said, "We will wait." For the next hour, as the townspeople discussed their recovery plans, the 2 cups sat on the table. Finally, Lars invited Silas to come forward. Silas first touched the exposed cup. It was barely lukewarm. Then he reached into the can and touched the second cup. He pulled his hand back as if burned. It's still hot, he whispered in awe. It's still scalding hot. A murmur went through the crowd. The lesson, delivered without a single word of theory, was more powerful than any lecture. The dead air had spoken for itself. That summer, a new sound filled the air in Pembina County, the rhythmic pounding of hammers. A cooperative spirit, born of shared hardship and newfound respect, took hold. Under Lars's quiet guidance, nearly every family in the township began retrofitting their homes. They set posts, nailed planks, and made endless trips to the sawmill for sawdust. They became experts in what they now called the Pembina Wall, or the Erickson Shell. They adapted the design to their own needs and resources. Some, lacking easy access to sawdust, experimented with chopped straw or dried prairie grass, learning that any material that trapped air would work, so long as it was kept dry. Silas Miller, with the zeal of a convert, built the most meticulous shell of all, a perfect 2-foot-wide envelope around his home, which he filled with a mixture of sawdust and wood shavings, just as Lars had done. The following winter arrived with a familiar ferocity, but for the people of the township, everything had changed. The results were immediate and dramatic. Families that had once burned through 10 or 12 cords of wood now found that 5 or 6 were more than sufficient. The savings in labor and resources were transformative. But the true measure of success was in the quality of life. The cabins were no longer drafty zones of misery. They were warm, comfortable sanctuaries. The local doctor, a circuit rider who served several townships, was astounded. On his winter rounds, he noted a staggering drop in cases of pneumonia, bronchitis, and other respiratory ailments that had once plagued the community, especially its most vulnerable members. Infants who would have struggled through the cold now thrived in the steady warmth. The elderly, who often succumbed during the harshest months, survived the winter in relative comfort. The Pembina Wall was not just an innovation in construction, it was a revolution in public health and community resilience. The story of the Erickson Shell did not remain confined to Pembina County. Mr. Abernathy, the schoolteacher, was a methodical documentarian. He had recorded the temperatures, the construction details, and the dramatic accounts of survival from the schoolhouse blizzard. He composed a long, detailed letter, complete with diagrams, and sent it to the Dakota Farmer, a widely read agricultural journal. The article, published under the headline, "A Lesson in Warmth from the Great Blizzard," was a sensation. It was reprinted in papers across the northern plains and into Canada. Letters poured into the Pembina post office, addressed to Lars Erickson. He answered them all, simply and directly, explaining the principle of the dead air gap. The idea spread, becoming a key feature of cold climate folk architecture on the frontier for decades to come. Lars Erickson's intuitive design was a remarkable piece of proto-scientific engineering. What he called dead air is what modern building science refers to as an effective insulation cavity. The R value, a measure of a material's resistance to heat flow, of his 18-inch sawdust-filled wall was likely in the range of R35 to R40. For comparison, a solid 10-inch log wall has an R value of around R12. Lars had, without any formal training, more than tripled the insulating capacity of his home. His outer wall and the air cavity also created a system that today's architects would recognize as a precursor to the rain screen and the double-stud wall, advanced techniques used in high-performance, energy-efficient construction. He instinctively understood the problem of thermal bridging, how a continuous solid material conducts cold, and solved it by creating a break. The Cree trapper Chayton's wisdom about APUs and the practical lesson of the Duluth Ice House had provided Lars with a deep, functional understanding of principles that scientists would not formally quantify for another 50 years. The story of Erickson's folly is more than a tale of clever construction. It is a parable about the nature of wisdom. It illustrates the triumph of practical, observational knowledge over rigid, unexamined convention. The settlers of Pembina County were not foolish. They were simply following the inherited wisdom of a different place, a different climate. Their methods were no longer sufficient for the brutal realities of the northern plains. Lars Eriksson's genius was not just in his memory of Norwegian building or his experience with an ice house, but in his humility and willingness to learn from any source. Even the quiet words of an indigenous guide, whose people had understood the secrets of this land for centuries. He synthesized these disparate pieces of knowledge into a solution that was perfectly adapted to its place and time. The legacy of that winter echoed for generations across the prairie. The folly that became a fortress stands as a quiet testament to a man who listened to the lessons of the cold instead of just fighting against it. He understood that survival depended not on the thickness of one's walls, but on the quality of one's thinking. In the heart of the unforgiving prairie, one man's supposed foolishness became a community's salvation, proving that the warmest shelter is not built from brute force or heavy timber, but from the simple, profound wisdom of a thin, unmoving layer of air.